Well, hey there. You're listening to Paradigm Shift, a podcast about people building a future in pivotal moments in their journey. And today we're thrilled to have Michael Stoppelman on the show. Michael was an early engineer at Yelp, where he helped build the engineering org from 6 to 600 people. He is an investor in over 300 startups. And nowadays he angel invests full-time and works on 2 nonprofits, which we're going to discuss. Michael, so thrilled to have you here to talk about all things Yelp, hiring and building world-class engineering teams, and angel investing.
I'm so excited to talk to you guys and share some lessons with all the founders out there and anyone interested in hearing my story. Honored to have you listening.
Amazing. So you joined Yelp fairly early in 2007. I actually remember Yelp during those days. I went to Columbia undergrad, and I remember there was like an on-campus activation one of my first weeks there. And I remember just thinking like, oh, there's like this startup and like, oh, you can like look up. It's like the whole concept was so new at that time. So it was a special time. But before we get to the Yelp story, I know you spent a little bit of time at Google before that. We'd love to hear about like how you ended up there and what were you working on while you were there?
I was actually pre-IPO Google. So that was a lucky break. I was there with Larry and Sergey. We were running around on Segways, and you could see Marissa eating lunch at the cafeteria without just eating alone. It was a very unique time. And so I joined in 2003 in July. And Google at the time was about 1,000 engineers or 1,000 employees. And I joined as a post-sales support engineer. And then a year into that, got sucked into the engineering team. So what happened was AdSense had just been born. And so AdSense was a product that allows for contextual targeting of ads on content. And that product had just launched when I joined Google. The group that I was in had a tool that was responsible for finding any publisher that they thought was clicking on their own ads or having people click on ads for them. So like a form of click fraud. That tool was housed inside of the group that I was in. And so I ended up adopting that tool and building out the tool to the point where the engineering team then sucked me into the engineering org because the tool was so useful to the ops team. And so then I became the tech lead for the click fraud team and led that team for the next 2.5 years. Later then joined an ads backend team that was working on cost per action ads. So kind of like looking at like whether transactions happen, because I felt like that was a great kind of like clicks are one thing, but having transaction data is another. And so thought the transaction data would be very valuable for Google's health. So worked on that for a year and then decided that it was time for me to leave Google. Google at the time had grown to like 15,000 employees. So in my head, it just felt so enormous. I always felt that I wanted to be at a startup. And so just so happened that my brother had started Yelp. And I had been connected to Yelp through the story and felt that it was the right timing for me to potentially join. And so decided to join and joined, not fully realizing how small it was. And so arrived at Yelp the first day, took like 0 days off from, it was like left Google, started at Yelp like 2 days later, and arrived and look around and it's like 6 of us. And I'm in charge of now the search engine, right? Like you're coming from Google, there's like all these engineers that are doing all these amazing things, but you're not like the bag holder for the whole thing. But then now you're thrust into this new spot. It's like, here's the search engine, you're in charge. It keeps crashing at 2 a.m. Go fix it, right? And so that was I was thrown into the deep end of the startup world. And it was hilarious because I was like, coming from Google scale, I was used to like, doing large scale stuff with like BigQuery type tools. And then at Yelp, it was like, all you really needed was cat and grep, right? It was like, there were no log files that were that big. So when I first looked at the search engine logs, I was like, oh, there were like 150,000 searches. That's interesting. And then when you actually looked at the searches, 86,400 of them were just the load balancer checking to see if the back end app was still like serving requests. So it was doing like little fake searches just to check to see that the thing was up. So 86,400 of them were actually like, that was each second, each second the little monitor was going, checking the search engine. So it's things like that that you start wrapping your head around. You're like, okay. And then I was on call for the search engine solo for the next 2 years to make sure that this thing didn't go down. And I was, I always had my phone with me just in case. Yeah. So that was kind of the like transition from Google days to Yelp days. And so I joined as the sixth engineer. My brother, of course, is co-founder and CEO. And then Russ Simmons was the CTO when I joined. And Neil Kumar was the VP of engineering when I joined Yelp. So he was there till the engineering team got to about 20, and then he left. He later went on to start a company called Carrot. He was CTO of Carrot, which does engineering interviews. You might have heard of it. And yeah, and so then I took over the engineering team at that 2020 scale and then stayed on for the next 8 or so years after I transitioned to taking it over when Neil left. We grew up to 600. And then I handed off the reins to one of the folks on my team at the time.
That's amazing. There's so much interesting things there to cover. I would love to go back to kind of the hyperscale growth at Google. I think you mentioned it's easy to miss it, but I think you said like the headcount was like 1,000 when you joined, and it grew to like 15,000. Like, was it in a few years? You couldn't have been there more than like 3 years or something.
Yeah.
So that's amazing. I'd love to hear and Google has built one of like the, I think, highest quality engineering kind of like teams at scale. So I'm curious, like, what in the early days you feel like they got right, and like how did they keep the quality so high when they grew like 15x in 3 years?
There are many lessons to be learned here from the Google scaling story. I think there are a few attributes of like incredible to scale companies. I think one is like economic rocket ship. Like that's one piece of it, right? Like the word goes out to the network that this place has so much money, they can pay you whatever. Like that's your first tell that you can attract awesome engineers, right? That's not the most important to most people, though, surprisingly. That's like, it's important to some, but it's not important to all. Number two is that you have crazy scale. So you computationally and an edge pushing of like where the technology is going, it's top in the world, right? And so Google had that, right? So it was like, hey, we have crazy computational scale. We're like racking and stacking thousands of machines a week. We're just growing so fast, we can't keep up with it. It's so exciting. We're inventing all these new technologies, MapReduce, GFC, Google File System, like BigQuery, like all these amazing technologies are starting to spawn. Like you're starting to see open source contributions that are really insane. We're adding to the Linux kernel things that like you haven't seen. Like so, it's like economics plus the being at the edge technologically, and then having like a positive impact on the world. Right? It's like those three things create Google. It's got a mission, like let's index the world's information. It's got the crazy economic scale, and it has like the money piece, the economic engine piece. And so once all three of those come into view, it's like like we can look at like other companies like SpaceX or other things where it's like clear mission, has a bit of the economic piece, but not as much as like the Google, SpaceX traditionally hasn't paid like the highest salaries in the world. So it's like those three, you can start looking at the pattern of like these hyperscale companies. You see it kind of repeating. So that was what I think drove that crazy Google scale, was that everyone, like whenever any engineer talked to any VC or anyone touching the company, board members, et cetera, former employees, they're like, you need to get on this rocket ship. This thing is going to the moon. Like you need to get on right now. And it gave this imperative that everyone needed to join Google. And I just got lucky in that I got swept up in that, but I could easily not, right? But like I was coming out of school, 2003. This was like Bush years, like .com bust had happened. We were in the wreckage of that. It was kind of like tech was in the crypto moment, right? Where it's like heads down, everyone's sad. Like it didn't, pets.com didn't work out at the time. It's like, everyone has to rebuild, right, at that time. And so 2003 was like a rebuild quiet year. And really, like one of the only companies really blitzscaling hiring at the time was Google. And so I got very lucky to find a job there. and found a job through this like kind of circuitous path. Some of the things that I saw applied at Google were Google would do everything it could to like allow engineers to work on their itch. Larry actually fired a huge amount of managers at the company in like 2002, 2001. There was a famous like all hands meeting where Larry, CEO, and he decided to fire all the managers. And that really set the tone for Google for the next 20 years. So there's like a lack of trust of management at Google, like in terms of like engineering management. At least when I was there, it was like you had a manager, but that manager had 150 reports. In the entire 4 years that I was at Google, I had no one-on-ones. Like I would see a manager when they needed to give me a like bonus check, or when I needed to, when I like I'd request a meeting if I needed to like change groups or something. But there was no career guidance. There was no, it was just the energy of Google was so great, and the momentum felt around Google was so great at the time. It was like you walk into anyone's office, it's like, oh my God, this is burning. This is growing so fast. You need to work on this ads database thing. We need to scale this thing out. We need more shards. Like there's so many problems just like right in front of us that it was just like, go, 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 get accomplished. I think what Google did really well was like let engineers run free when it's very when it was very clear what the mission was. And I think that that's true of like a lot of organizations. When you have a mission, when you need to accomplish something that's like straightforward, it's very easy to motivate engineers. It gets more complicated when it's like, hey, we have these GDPR requirements and we need to move the data between these 15 different locations. And it's really complicated and it involves governments and policy people and legal and whatever. That's when you need management. It's like, not when it's like, hey, we need to get the search engine launched by this date. And, there's no other, like, it's just straightforward technology. But as soon as you start having this government mixed with policy stuff, it starts to get, and then the addition of all these partners and different factions that want different pieces of the product. And then when you're coordinating with partners for launches, I'm sure you dealt with this at DuckDuckGo, it's like, it gets complicated very fast, right? But at the beginning of Google, it was very clear, like, okay, we have no partners. We're just going, like, we just need to get this stuff launched. So I always saw it as like an engineer has like a vector. They have a direction and a magnitude, and they're headed in some direction. And if you let the engineer kind of move in that direction with that vector force, they're headed they're within a few degrees of like where you want them to go. That's awesome. The moment you need an engineer to go like 30 or 40 degrees, you need lots more management to get the engineer in that direction. Google did really well at just letting engineers go with their vector. Like they just like, if you were really good, they would just like let you go. And then I think that's why you see Google has like 5 operating systems. They have 5 different compilers at Google that they're supporting. Different random, they're doing protein folding, they're building chips, they're doing all these things. It's like they let engineers come in and then go, okay, if this person's a brilliant person, like go like figure out like which direction. And then they'll guide the engineers by like funding of like what their team gets. Right. So it's like, we don't want this direction to go. So like, we just won't fund it. Right. Like there will be no money for it. The management team controls via the purse strings. And so it's I saw that as the way that they were running the company at the time. I haven't been there for many, many years, but I felt like that was the way that they were shaping engineering opinion, was actually through hiring decisions and through how they were channeling the money. So it's like computational resources, right? So if they didn't like your database, you just like wouldn't get any SRE resources for it. And then your database goes nowhere, right? So it was kind of a passive aggressive way to like manage the team, but it was kind of like how Google managed the world. Like, and you can imagine if you had 150 reports, that's what you would probably do too.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I mean, Google is just like such special, like violent product market fit and such clear like pull from the market just to keep up, where it clearly worked really well. So, and that was the only experience you'd had in an engineering role when you landed at Yelp. How was Yelp different? And some things that come to mind are clearly like much smaller, 6 engineers. Also like not as much of a monopoly, I think. Yelp had a lot more competition in the early days, I think. So what did you find as like a person on that early team was different, and how did you approach it? And we'd love to get a sense of what some of the different phases of product market fit and scaling looked like in the context of Yelp.
Yeah, so I didn't have the perspective that I now do as an investor, where it's like, oh, is it doing 3x growth? Is it doing 5x growth? Is it doing whatever? It was like, is it growing or not? Like, is it a product I use or don't? It was like more like just like human interaction stuff. I didn't really know the metrics that were going into it. In retrospect, I can't tell you if Yelp had like 3x revenue growth or 2x or what was the user count growth. All I knew is that our goal was to get past city search. I don't know if you remember, there was a competitor that we had called City Search, and that was like the big player. And then it was like, that was seen as our North Star to like, oh, if we could get to 14 million uniques, like we won, in terms of the first battle. And so I remember us, we had Google Analytics and we saw it go past 14 and then it just kept going. And we were like, oh, this is great. I'd say some of the differences between like a Google scale and Yelp is like, Google just had this money printing machine by the time I had gotten there that was so strong. It just allowed Google to get involved in all sorts of different areas. So if you probably did a survey of computer science professors in North America, and you ask them if they get a grant or they're on a stipend or they've worked at Google and they still are getting paid by Google, I bet you 50% of them would say yes. Like 50% of probably professors in North America are probably somehow economically tied to Google in some way. And so that makes it very difficult to do college recruiting and get talent from schools, because like the first employees that a professor has, the first graduate students are going to go check out Google before they're going to check out anything else. And if you look at the hiring numbers, like from North American schools, when you zoom out, there's 50,000 graduates a year in computer science, right? And so Google, up until recently, was hiring as many as they could, right? So they were, let's say, 150,000 person company. Engineering was like 75 or 100,000. They have a five-year retention. They're hiring tens of thousands of engineers, and so they were, in terms of new grads, just to keep Google at the same size, they were probably hiring half of the new grads in America, right? Just to stay inside. So it's just like the scale and the difference of like where Google was versus Yelp is like, it was like different. We're in a different ball game, right? In terms of like Google's hiring tens of thousands of engineers a quarter, Yelp is hiring hundreds a quarter, right? It's a different ball game. So back to my analogy of like, mission, Yelp had an awesome mission, was growing really nicely. Economically, if you look at the business models and the businesses, it's like different ballgame, right? So Google's been growing at 20%, 20 to 30% for the last 20 years. It's like, it's a monster, right? And so it's hard to compete with the biggest monster in the world. So Yelp, economically, we couldn't compete with Google offers, but with mission we could, and then also with impact we could. And so that's how I built the team, was focus on the things you're strong at. So what I would say to any founder is like, you want to focus on the things that you can really drive. And so I would always use the Google bureaucracy. The thing that always affected me as an engineer there was to compile the binary that I was working on by the end at Google. It would take 6 minutes to compile this binary. And then it would take 3 weeks to see it out on the website, right? And I'm sure things have changed all at Google and they're much faster and they have CI/CD. But when I left Google, it was like this 3-week cycle. And I was like, this is so slow and boring. And so at Yelp, I made it our rule that you had to be able to get a change and be able to push it out to the website if you're a new engineer within 3 days of joining a company. And that's what I stuck to the entire time I was there. I was like, I never wanted to become unfun to be an engineer. Because engineering at the end of the day is fun. It's like we're building shit, we're getting stuff on the website, we're seeing it on the mobile app. It's like, it's exciting. It's like people are using my stuff, right? That's the dopamine loop that you want to get your engineers into, because that's what rewards and feeds. It's like you can pay them. No, I like to say, one of my quotes is that in capitalism, no one is ever paid enough. Like, there's no engineer at Google or at Yelp or at LinkedIn or at any of these Microsoft, any of these companies that's ever paid enough. It's like the moment they get the bonus, it's not big enough bonus. It's like the human brain just is always like more, 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 more. And so what's the thing that you can really focus on as a manager or as an executive is like, how fast can my engineers get code shipped? Are they getting stuff shipped or is it getting shelved? Are the most demotivating thing for an engineer is to work on something for a few months and then product or an executive go, we're scrapping the direction. We're going in a different direction. These two VPs didn't talk. It's a wrong product strategy. We've got to cancel it. Or two teams were building the same thing and you find out 6 months later. That stuff happens all the time in corporate America. And it's so demoralizing. So I was always looking, how do we make sure and shield engineers from these demotivating type of things? And how do we build a culture that like focuses on excellence? What I like to describe Yelp's culture is pragmatic Google. Like I saw the beauty of letting engineers work on what they're passionate about. That means that they work endless hours on the thing that they're really excited about because they like love it. It's like beyond work. It's like, it's part of them. And so if I can harness the like force and the direction of that vector, but for business value, we need to turn it 10 degrees. It's like, that's what you want. You want to be able to like move with gravity or move like very gently, move that vector to the right thing. And then it's like, okay, the engineer gets to work on what they want to work on. They're really passionate about service-oriented architecture. And, you know, they really want to do it in Go, but we're going to be moving in this direction with Python. It's like, hey, like you get to work on services. It's not going to be in Go. It's going to be in Python. It's okay. You know, it's like at least that vector is then going in the right direction for the business. Because at the end of the day, as an executive or a founder, you own the code. You own that system. That engineer might work for you for 2 or 4 years. So if they write that thing in Rust or they write it in some esoteric language that you're not really like passionate about, the rest of your team is not passionate about, like Erlang or something, you could get totally hosed, right? You always have to be careful of like, you know, at Google, it was like, they described it as the happy path. So what would happen is, okay, if you build for Bigtable, there will be SRE resources for you, and you won't have to be on call. If you build for any other database, you're going to have to be on call. So then you get engineering simplicity. So I applied that at Yelp. So it was like we had SREs that would support certain backends. If you wanted to do your own backend, sure, you can do that. You have to write up a doc of how you're going to do this, but you're going to be on call. Or you could go this easier path where we have redundancy, we have backups, we have all this stuff, we have all this infrastructure. We've figured out all the drivers. It goes into Splunk. It goes into all the monitoring systems. You don't have to worry about it. Or you could go your painful path, right? And so engineers always go like the less painful path, right? Generally. The energy with engineering, building an awesome engineering culture is letting engineers really scratch their itch, but like try to drive it towards things that like management's challenge is to, I think, drive towards those bigger like product goals. So there's the engineering energy and then there's the business energy. And I think management's challenge is to channel those two together. Right.
So I think that's an amazing example of how you could shape the technologies and the stack that got like the most funding, but also like that engineers sort of aligned with. How did you think about that from a product perspective? Say an engineer joins and they want to like work on a search problem, or they want to work on a restaurant booking service problem. How did you kind of like help them align their vector with where the company needed to go?
Yeah. So like product is the place that you get the most, that's the most frictiony spot. So you'll get the most dissent or the strongest feelings of like not being aligned with the business. So we did a few things to like kind of like let out steam there. Number one, we did a hackathon 3 times a year. And so that hackathon would last 2 days. We iterated on the design of the hackathon presentation. We iterated to a science fair format. So it would be on a Thursday and Friday. And then Friday would be, you would show off your stuff. And then we'd have the entire team people built apps after a while for Hackathon, but everyone would be able to go through and rate each project. And what that would allow is like if an engineer was really passionate about review recommendations or events or whatever feature they hated on Yelp or what they wanted to change, they would be able to express that in a hackathon and then allow people to vote on it in this science fair format. And it would allow the product team to then see these different ideas and see what engineers had in their heads and be able to like then pick and choose ideas. And one thing that happens in businesses is that you end up with a history of things that failed and then you refuse to do them ever again. So you might have a product idea or a direction. You tried it. You had a product manager that worked on it. It failed. And then forever, for the history of the company, it's like, we tried it. We're never going to do it again. And what ends up happening is, was the product manager the right person for that job? Like, was the engineer working on it the right person for the job? And is the technology the same, right? It's like the Newton was too early for Apple, right? And then you get the iPad 10, 20 years later, and it's the right tool for the right job.
Yeah. So how to like resolve the friction between what an engineer wants to work on a product and like the direction? I think hackathons are a great way to do that. And I think your example of like companies trying things once and then giving up too early or never going back to it resonates for me, having been at some big companies. So that's very true, I think.
Yeah. It's also like, when you think about like how much has changed in the AI landscape over the last 3 years. It's like if you had tried to do something like a chat interface 3 years ago, you would be too early. And today you would not. So what I saw in hackathons was actually the retry of ideas with the current technology base. And it would change the product. And the product would get like closer and closer to something that we could use. So I'll give you an idea. We have this idea of like, okay, we want to be able to understand menus and photos better. And the invention of like all the deep learning stuff enabled us to be able, on Yelp, like when you get to a business page and you look at the photos, on a restaurant, it will sort it into outside, inside, drinks photos, foods photos. That categorization is driven by machine learning of a deep learning model. So there's no human interaction there. It's simply a machine learning model. That's an example of like something that came from a hackathon and was we had tried to do that with previous technology, but then it was only in 2014 that there was an open source model that we could use to do that, right? And then it just completely unlocked and allowed us to do something that we had hoped to do before, right? And so it enables these new product features. So one thing that I'd resonate or like kind of remind founders and folks that want to do these hackathons is like the format of how you let the team share the ideas is really important. We started off with like a microphone and a presentation. Each person would make a few slides, and then we iterated to the science fair format. And I would encourage anyone, the science fair format is by far a superior format, at least at Yelp. And it kind of allowed for more organic people to move around and less people to get bored and was just less. Some of the energy when you do a presentation can be aggressive towards the product team or towards design. And we felt that the energy was better when it was more of a science fair format. So I thought that was like a cool, I don't know what other companies are doing in the remote world, but I'd recommend it.
What you're saying resonates so much that like even the specific example of using Golang versus Python just reminds me of a situation where there's like an engineer who really wanted to use Golang, but like the company did not have a single server running Golang, and it was like a similar situation. You'd be like, well, it's a great tool, but like you kind of like have to handle the expectations of the person. And I think the hackathon's like a great way to do that because it's like you're free reign. Like, oh yeah, you can go build that service if you want. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I know you interviewed 4,000 to 5,000 people over the course of your career. Like that's amazing. Very few people have that much data to like kind of train on. And I think a lot of people struggle with like identifying what exceptional looks like. Like we've all seen the situation where you hire someone and like week one, you're like, oh my fucking God, they're incredible. Like, unfortunately, it's like it doesn't happen all the time. But I'd love to get your thoughts on like, how do you identify exceptional talent? Like, are there frameworks you've used? Are there heuristics? Is it a systems problem? Like, what have you found is like, increases the probability that you can identify someone who's exceptional?
I'd say that like my observation of my interviewing for software engineering talent became a little less confident after I had enough data points because I thought that I knew what the perfect person looked like. In my head, I had the stereotype. But then over time, when you get a ton of data and you see all the different pieces of engineering, where it's like the communication piece, the professionalism piece, the like, how loyal is the person going to be? And like you wrap up all of these different features and then you go like, I've had the intern, like I was at a college fair and this freshman came up and he was like, how do I get an internship at Yelp? I was like, it's hard as a freshman because like we don't have that many slots. And then I was like, send me something that I'm super impressed by. And so 2 months later, I get a link from this engineer at MIT. He was at MIT. He had built like a compiler and assembly or JavaScript for the Knuth pseudo assembly language. It's like mind blown, right? You're just like, kid's a genius. He came and worked at the company for a summer and he ended up like struggling because he didn't have the communication skills and didn't have the maturity to explain like, hey, I'm getting really frustrated with my team. I think I'm in the wrong spot. So he ended up not having a productive summer because of that. So it's like you might have an outlier. He ended up going to work at like, some like virtual machine company in the end, which is like totally the perfect spot for him. But it's important that one thing to think about is like an outlier engineer for Google might not be an outlier engineer for you because your problem space might be different and the things that engineer is motivated by might not apply to your company. And the amount of money that you have to pay to have that outlier person doesn't make sense to your business model compared to a Google. So like a machine learning engineer for Google that works on the ad system that increases revenue by 1% adds $1 billion to Google's bottom line, assuming $100 billion, to a Yelp that one engineer, if Yelp's revenue is $2 billion, right, it doesn't add as much money to the bottom line. That's one thing. But like in terms of like what are the things that you look for, it's like there's the classic things of like, okay, like they can answer these questions really fast in the interviews and all of, that type of stuff. What I usually zoom out to look at is like, what's the history of them accomplishing amazing things? And then what do the previous people that have worked with them say about them? I weight that so much more than I weight what I see in an interview because I personally don't perform that well in an interview. It's not like my strength. And so if someone were to judge me on like my interview performance, it's like not a great characterization of all the skills that I bring to the table. So I always would do that. We iterated a lot of interviews at Yelp. Like we tried to do code tests before interview. We ended up killing that because it cut the pipeline down so much. Like people just didn't turn in their code tests. And so, in the world of competition, it's like if Dropbox isn't asking for a code test, they're going to go to Dropbox before they're going to go to you because like engineers have a full-time job probably that they're coming from. I think that like you're looking for folks with a generally positive attitude. The real negative energy, super smart people really at scale for your company really drag you down. So I really was negative on people that brought the dark energy with them. So I was pretty heavy filter on that.
Having done thousands of interviews, usually like folks I've met figure out a few questions that they love to ask because they get a lot of signal from those. And so I'm curious, like, did you find yourself asking certain similar questions to like understand what someone has accomplished in the past? And did you sort of evaluate some of those answers?
So one question I really liked was, I'm going to call your previous manager. Can you tell me 3 adjectives that they will use to describe you? And then I'm going to talk to your teammates and then they're going to give me some adjectives to describe you. Can you give me those adjectives? Like what are they going to say? And then I'm going to ask your manager, like, what are you working on with them? Like what types of skills are you working on? And engineers as a cohort are pretty honest. Like if you ask the same questions of salespeople, you're not going to get as forthright answers. I've interviewed salespeople. I know from actual data. So what I would say is like those questions give you some idea of like what folks are going to say about the person. And I'll say from like personal experience, like one thing I would do with high value candidates is sometimes I'd email them, they'd have references and I'd email the references and I'd say, because some companies actually have restrictions on what you can say about a previous person. But if you've had an awesome person on your team and you get an email and the email says, if this person was outlier for your previous team, please respond back or ignore this email. And so if you got that as like a referral, it's like, okay, do I screw over the person that's trying to get a job or do I just reply to the email? You don't have to say anything. All you need to do is reply to the email. So I used to do that and that would give me strong, like the people that didn't get those replies and I still hired them, I regretted most of them. The people that like get the reply really fast and like the person's like, you're lucky to hire them. That's one of the stronger signals I found. So, I mean, you get a feeling for like when someone's describing, hey, I built this system, I moved the company from a monolith to a service-oriented architecture, and I used this and this technology, and they go into like, any layer of depth, they go into that depth. You get a sense for like, okay, they probably built all this stuff. Like, it gets, like most of the roles that you're hiring for don't require these outlier, like the nuts and bolts of engineering. It's like, yes, you need like 10 outlier people, right, to like be able to build some of these web scale things. But the number of outlier people actually is going down as all of the tools exist in the open source world and exist in the cloud systems. Like we're moving to a world where there's less need for these outliers, and there's actually like you're enabling more of the folks that are in the middle tier to like be able to kind of contribute at the outlier level, because these low code tools are doing a lot of the things that you might have maybe 10 years ago, you'd need the assembly knowledgeable person to like optimize some loops for your thing. But now like the compilers have gotten good enough and like they're doing enough advanced algorithms, you don't really need that stuff as much.
It's very, very helpful. So it's funny you bring up kind of like the bell curve distribution. We had Keith Ruboy on here, and he kind of drew a similar link, two links that I think are interesting. One is that as you like engineering talent, you kind of need like top 10%, like maybe top 20% to like be effective and build an org. And maybe as the org gets bigger and bigger, you can be a little more lax on that. But when it comes to like investing or like founders, you're looking for like top 1%, top 0.1%. So you're really going out on like the kind of the distribution. And the other thing you mentioned was that like hiring in a lot of ways kind of builds the muscle, is one way of building the muscle to identifying kind of exceptional founders. And so I would love to transition to your angel investing, because I know you've done an insane number of investments, like 300 investments total. And I think in your first year, you did like 50 investments in 1 year. So would love to ask you the same question about kind of identifying founders. Like when you're looking at all of these investments coming your way on a weekly basis, like what are you looking for to identify kind of exceptional founders, and what kind of piques your interest?
When looking at founders, it's very similar to the hiring stuff. Like you're using similar skills, but you're listening for like, you're more valuing like, okay, what did they do previously? Who is the inbound lead to the person? Is the inbound lead, like a lot of times I'm dealing with leads that an investor like a Keith is investing $3, $4, $10 million into. And so you have like PageRank going to this founder going like, the person that decided, took this meeting, vetted through them, did the whole like, some associate did all the background, checking of this person, and they've done a background check and they've decided that they want to like put $10 million or $4 million behind this person. That's a much easier interview than I meet someone through YC or I meet someone through Techstars randomly. I don't have any background on them. And I'm deciding to put 25 to 200K into this company on my own, right? That's like a different problem than the like Keith intro, right? And so I'd say 30 to 40% of my intros are like from investors doing a round and they want my skill set involved in the deal. That's my cheat code. My cheat code is like through my network, people introing. On the like, okay, I have like semi-random inbound I'm doing like a YC, like I'm interviewing, Zane's YC company. I'm looking at like, okay, the first question I ask myself is, I invest a lot in like B2B software. So I go, is this a business problem that Zane previously solved at his last company and thinks that other companies need to solve, right? And so I always I tend to value anyone that's like been in a business and they solve some problem for like one of these larger companies, Pinterest, Yelp, Uber, Meta, any of these types of companies. If you have an engineering team that solved a problem for them, they're actually like, when you look at it, they're actually like 10 years or 7 years ahead of the market. So the question is more, okay, there is a problem in all these businesses that's going to arise. This team is 10 years ahead. So is the market going to be ready for the product that they build? Or am I too early? Or is it like, are they building in the right way that like the market's going to understand? And so an example of this is like, I've invested in a number of like easy to use machine learning tools, right? So it's like, hey, like we want to enable machine learning for like all different departments, whatever. It's like the market has been not ready for it now going on 6 years. So most of the challenges lie in like getting your data into some database and like your data ETL. I'm talking about like not the 50 companies that you think about in Silicon Valley. I'm talking about the next 5,000, right? We go into like a mattress discounter's data warehouse and we go like, what? I wonder how they're running data. The data is probably spread in a data warehouse and like flat files and like Excel spreadsheets. It's like, it's everywhere. And that's still the case in most enterprises. And so I've invested in like 6 different easy to use machine learning tools. We're still seemingly too early. Like that's my sentiment on the space. It's still been too early, but that's the problem with doing angel investing is, I made these 6 bets. Maybe the 7th bet is the right one, or maybe one of the ones in the previous 6 is going to be the winner, and it just took 6 years to get here, right? And so that's the challenge with the angel investing game is like, are you too early on the market, or are you kind of like? Usually, I've been like that's been the challenge is like you're too early for the market, and the market takes a while to build up, right?
That's amazing. Those are really helpful heuristics. It kind of ties back to your kind of previous your hiring heuristic of like, have they solved hard problems in the past? Have they like, is there behavioral evidence that they've done this? It's similar to like, have they solved this exact problem they're now solving for other people? So that's helpful to know.
One of the things I also look for is anyone that like they built an open source thing at a company and then they're kind of leading that open source charge and then they're commercializing it. Like I do a lot of deals in that type of space, trying to help help technical founders take a technical project and then build a business around it. It's hard to get that kind of distribution. And so like if they have the distribution into the enterprise, like that's such a huge leg up. And so I'm always excited about founders that have figured out, like a way into the enterprise. And the best case is like enterprises are already asking them for features. And so they kind of have their product roadmap already kind of called out. That's always exciting. So the first company that I invested that did that is like Confluent. So Confluent's an example. So that was Kafka, the open source.
Amazing. So we like to ask guests a few questions at the end of every show, and the first one's around feedback. What's the most difficult / kind of challenging feedback you've received, and how have you incorporated it and processed it moving forward?
It's a good question. So in the past, I've gotten feedback like you can't tell from Zoom, but I'm pretty large with respect to most employees. I'm pretty tall, and so in one-on-ones, I kept receiving feedback of like I felt very intimidating, and I think it came from like a physically intimidating, and so I was always mindful. Like as you rise in an organization, you have a default amount of perceived power and perceived influence, and people react really strongly to that. So it's like physical presence, but then also like the stature you have in the organization. So like if you're 4 levels away from an engineer and you ask them about a project, that is the like scariest thing in their like month that they've dealt with, right? It's like my boss's boss just asked me about this project that I'm working on. They know about it. and like they're worried about it. And like in my head, I'm thinking, I just want to make a connection with this engineer so I can retain them longer. like that's all I wanted to do, right? Was like make small talk in the elevator about this conversation and talk about this thing. And in my head, I'm thinking, oh, they'll be excited that I like know that they're working on this project. And like I wanted to know what was going on. But they see it as like, oh my gosh, it's like this is so scary, So one of the things as a manager, you have to realize that your words are treated so differently than any peer. And so it was something that I had to like kind of like learn was the power of my words when talking to anyone in the organization because as you go from startup to like bigger company, it's like we became a public company, like we were doing the Wall Street thing, all that stuff. It's like it just changes how your words are perceived. And so that was a big piece of feedback that I had to then kind of grapple with of like, this sucks that I can't talk to my team in the way that I want to, but like I understand that the rules of the game have changed.
That's amazing. That's great. Michael, you've been so generous with your time. I just have one last one, which is around superpowers. Everyone has a set of skills that feels like play to them, but work to others. Are there like superpowers you've identified in yourself that you like to lean on day to day?
I realized that like I like helping people. And so that's why I do the angel investor thing. And I do it as a solo thing, not in a fund. Because I like to help people out. And then I realized that I could become economically aligned with all these people. And then I could help them out with their thing. And then I get upside if that works out. And then they get my help, which I enjoy giving. So it's like, I realized that like, that's what I like doing. And that's why the angel investor thing works for my blueprint of like who I am.
That's amazing. Well, it totally makes sense. I mean, you shared a lot of helpful wisdom. I know Zane and I have learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. So I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and sharing some of the stories from the early days of Yelp and all the things you've learned hiring and angel investing. We appreciate it. We'd love to have you on sometime again in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Enjoy.